Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. ID.AM-04, cataloging supplier-provided services. The ID.IAM-04 ensures that organizations maintain an accurate and up-to-date inventory of all services provided by third-party suppliers, enabling effective cybersecurity risk management, compliance enforcement, and supply chain security governance. This subcategory belongs to the Identify function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0, emphasizing that understanding the full scope of supplier-provided services is critical to preventing cybersecurity risks, ensuring service continuity, and enforcing security policies across external partnerships. Without structured cataloging of supplier services, organizations risk failing to monitor vendor security compliance, overlooking hidden dependencies within supply chain operations, and increasing exposure to third-party cybersecurity risks. By cataloging supplier-provided services, organizations ensure that all vendor relationships are documented, security controls are applied to third-party services, and service-level agreements, SLAs, include enforceable cybersecurity requirements. A structured approach to supplier service inventory management allows organizations to track third-party security performance, mitigate supply chain cybersecurity risks, and ensure vendor compliance with industry-specific security standards. Organizations that deploy automated supplier tracking tools, enforce structured vendor inventory policies, and integrate supplier risk assessments into cybersecurity governance improve their ability to prevent third-party cyber threats, reduce operational dependencies on unsecured vendor services, and strengthen regulatory compliance. Multiple stakeholders play a role in cataloging supplier-provided services. Procurement and vendor management teams are responsible for maintaining supplier service inventories, ensuring that vendors meet security compliance requirements, and tracking changes in supplier service agreements. Cybersecurity and risk management teams ensure that third-party services are continuously assessed for security vulnerabilities, vendor risk profiles are updated regularly, and supplier security breaches are detected and mitigated effectively. Legal and compliance officers ensure that supplier service tracking aligns with contractual security requirements, regulatory data protection obligations, and enterprise-wide cybersecurity risk governance. Supplier-provided service cataloging is implemented through structured vendor tracking policies, continuous supplier risk assessments, and automated service inventory management solutions. This includes documenting all third-party service agreements, integrating supplier service inventories with cybersecurity monitoring tools, and enforcing security compliance requirements throughout vendor service lifecycle. Organizations that fail to maintain an updated inventory of supplier-provided services risk losing visibility into vendor security risks, failing to detect vulnerabilities in external service integrations, and facing compliance violations due to lack of oversight over third-party security obligations. Several key terms define supplier-provided service cataloging and its role in cybersecurity governance. Third-party service inventory management ensures that organizations track all external services used across business operations, maintaining real-time visibility into supplier security postures. Vendor risk assessment and compliance audits require organizations to evaluate supplier security risks, ensuring that vendors adhere to enterprise security policies. Supplier Service Level Agreement (SLA) enforcement ensures that organizations define clear cybersecurity requirements for vendor service engagements, holding suppliers accountable for maintaining security compliance. Regulatory compliance for third-party services mandates that organizations align supplier service tracking with legal cybersecurity framework. Continuous vendor performance monitoring ensures that organizations track supplier service effectiveness, security reliability, and overall compliance with cybersecurity best practices. Challenges in cataloging supplier-provided services often lead to incomplete vendor inventories, weak enforcement of third-party cybersecurity policies, and failure to integrate supplier service tracking into broader cybersecurity risk management frameworks. One common issue is lack of visibility into vendor service dependencies, where organizations fail to track how external services integrate into business operations, leading to security blind spots. Another issue is failure to monitor supplier service security compliance, where organizations assume that vendors maintain secure environments without conducting independent security assessments. Some organizations mistakenly believe that supplier service tracking is only necessary for critical vendors, without recognizing that all third-party services, regardless of perceived risk level, can introduce cybersecurity threats if they are not properly monitored. When organizations implement structured cataloging of supplier-provided services, they enhance supply chain resilience, improve vendor cybersecurity compliance, and ensure that third-party service risks are continuously mitigated. A structured supplier service tracking framework ensures that vendor security compliance remains in force, supplier risk assessments remain comprehensive, and cybersecurity risk mitigation strategies remain aligned with enterprise governance requirements. Organizations that implement structured supplier service inventory management policies, enforce automated vendor service tracking mechanisms, and integrate supplier monitoring into enterprise security strategies develop a comprehensive supply chain security framework that strengthens third-party service resilience and reduces vendor cybersecurity risks proactively. Organizations that fail to catalog supplier-provided services effectively face significant cybersecurity, operational, and compliance risks. Without structured vendor service tracking, businesses risk losing visibility into third-party service dependencies, failing to detect cybersecurity vulnerabilities introduced by external providers, and encountering regulatory compliance violations due to insufficient oversight of supplier security requirements. A common issue is lack of integration between vendor service tracking and enterprise security policies, where organizations maintain a list of third-party services but fail to assess their cybersecurity impact, leading to gaps in risk management. Another major challenge is failure to enforce cybersecurity controls across supplier-provided services, where organizations assume that vendors adhere to security best practices without conducting independent security assessments, increasing exposure to third-party cyber threats. By implementing structured cataloging of supplier-provided services, organizations ensure that vendor service risks are proactively identified, third-party security compliance is continuously monitored, and supply chain security governance remains enforceable. A well-defined supplier service inventory management framework improves vendor security transparency, ensures that third-party service contracts include enforceable cybersecurity obligations, and reduces the risk of service disruptions caused by vendor security incidents. Organizations that deploy automated supplier service tracking solutions, enforce continuous vendor security assessments, and integrate supplier service inventories with cybersecurity governance models improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate third-party service cybersecurity risks efficiently. At the partial tier, organizations lack structured supplier service cataloging processes, leading to unorganized third-party service tracking, unverified vendor security compliance, and weak enforcement of supplier cybersecurity policies. Vendor service tracking is handled reactively, with organizations only addressing supplier security risks after a cybersecurity incident occurs. A small business at this level may rely on cloud-based software services for payroll processing or customer management, but fail to track how these vendors manage security, leading to potential data protection risks. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured supplier service inventory management policies, ensuring that key vendor relationships are documented and periodically reviewed for security compliance. However, vendor service tracking efforts may still be limited, with inconsistent application of security assessments across different supplier tiers. A mid-sized financial institution at this level may track the security compliance of critical banking software providers, but fail to monitor smaller, third-party vendors providing support services, creating potential security gaps. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured supplier service inventory framework, ensuring that all vendor-provided services are continuously monitored, third-party security policies are applied consistently, and vendor cybersecurity compliance remains actively enforced. Supplier service security governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing vendor service security assessments and ensuring that supplier risk management remains a key component of enterprise cybersecurity strategies. A global manufacturing company at this stage may require all suppliers, logistics partners, and cloud-based service providers to participate in structured security compliance reviews, ensuring that third-party cybersecurity risks are managed proactively. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven vendor risk intelligence platforms, predictive third-party security analytics, and automated supplier service monitoring tools to dynamically track vendor-provided service risks, detect anomalies in third-party service security performance, and enforce vendor cybersecurity compliance requirements in real time. Supplier security management is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that vendor service tracking, supplier risk assessments, and third-party security compliance monitoring remain continuously optimized. A multinational technology corporation at this level may use AI-powered supply chain security analytics to assess vendor security postures, enforce automated third-party compliance verification, and dynamically adjust supplier service tracking policies based on evolving cybersecurity threats. Cataloging supplier-provided services aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured vendor service tracking frameworks and dynamic third-party security compliance enforcement models. One key control is SA-4 acquisition process, which requires organizations to define structured security requirements in supplier contracts, ensuring that third-party service engagements align with enterprise cybersecurity policies. A global energy provider implementing this control may require all third-party service providers to undergo security risk assessments before entering contractual agreements, ensuring that vendor services meet predefined security standards. Another key control is PM-10 security authorization processes, which mandates that organizations establish structured approval workflows for onboarding and monitoring supplier-provided services, ensuring that vendors meet enterprise security compliance requirements. A financial institution implementing this control may require executive-level review and cybersecurity risk assessments for all third-party technology service providers, ensuring that vendor engagements align with banking security regulation. Cataloging supplier-provided services also aligns with CA-7 continuous monitoring, which requires organizations to continuously assess vendor security performance, ensuring that supplier-provided services maintain compliance with cybersecurity policies over time. This control ensures that organizations monitor third-party service security risks dynamically, allowing for proactive detection of vulnerabilities and enforcement of security requirements. A multinational telecommunications provider implementing this control may use AI-powered vendor monitoring tools to track supplier security compliance in real time, ensuring that third-party services remain aligned with enterprise cybersecurity risk management strategies. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic vendor service tracking measures, ensuring that all third-party services are documented in a centralized inventory and periodically reviewed for security compliance. A large enterprise may deploy AI-driven supplier service tracking platforms, automated vendor risk assessment tools, and predictive third-party security intelligence solutions, to ensure that supplier-provided services remain continuously monitored and aligned with evolving cybersecurity threats. Organizations in highly regulated industries, such as healthcare, financial services, and critical infrastructure, may require legally mandated supplier service security audits, continuous third-party risk assessments, and strict service level agreement (SLA) enforcement to ensure third-party cybersecurity compliance. Auditors assess supplier-provided service cataloging by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced vendor service inventory management frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured supplier service tracking models, enforce third-party security risk assessments, and integrate supplier security compliance verification measures into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. If an organization fails to catalog supplier-prohibited services effectively, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in vendor security oversight, weak enforcement of third-party cybersecurity compliance, and failure to align supplier service tracking with enterprise cybersecurity risk mitigation strategies. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Supplier service inventory reports and structured vendor tracking documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured supplier service management governance models. Third-party cybersecurity compliance tracking records and vendor service security audit reports provide insights into whether organizations proactively monitor supplier security performance and refine vendor service tracking policies based on real-time cybersecurity risk intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to supplier service security failures and third-party vendor risk mitigation reports show whether organizations effectively track supplier-provided service cybersecurity risks, ensuring that vendor service compliance remains continuously enforced. A compliance success scenario could involve a global logistics provider that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that supplier service inventory management processes are fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that all vendor-provided services are continuously monitored, third-party cybersecurity compliance frameworks are actively enforced, and supplier service security governance remains aligned with regulatory cybersecurity risk management standards. Auditors confirm that supplier service security risks are systematically managed, vendor service compliance is continuously enforced, and supplier service tracking governance aligns with enterprise cybersecurity risk mitigation strategies. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured supplier service cataloging frameworks, neglects vendor cybersecurity compliance verification, or lacks formalized supplier service tracking oversight models may receive audit findings for poor supplier risk management, weak third-party cybersecurity compliance enforcement, and failure to integrate supplier service security risk assessments into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that supplier-provided service cataloging remains continuous and effective. One major challenge is lack of visibility into third-party service dependencies, where organizations fail to track how supplier-provided services integrate with business operations, leading to security blind spots. Another challenge is failure to align supplier service cataloging policies with regulatory compliance requirements, where organizations lack predefined third-party security verification measures, increasing exposure to compliance violations and regulatory penalties. A final challenge is over-reliance on vendor self-reporting, where organizations accept supplier security attestations without conducting independent third-party cybersecurity risk assessments, leading to potential oversights in vendor service security governance. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured supplier service cataloging frameworks, ensuring that vendor security compliance tracking remains continuously enforced, and integrating supplier-provided service risk assessments into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. Investing in automated vendor service security compliance tracking platforms, predictive supplier risk assessment models, and AI-driven third-party service monitoring tools ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine supplier service cataloging strategies in real time. Standardizing supplier cybersecurity governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that supplier security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to third-party service cyber threats and strengthening enterprise-wide supply chain security resilience. By embedding supplier prohibition service cataloging into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance vendor service security accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable supplier risk management strategies across evolving cybersecurity landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.